So this will not be a research talk. I will not give you a complicated philosophy talk, and you will learn almost nothing about my own work tonight. I want to rather offer you some simple conceptual tools and lay some foundations for the discussion we're going to have afterwards in about 40 minutes. So I want to look at the wider context of all these things that are now taking place, and I want to highlight 3 classical philosophical virtues we will need in this transition. And then I want to present an updated version of the Enculturation Protocol that was first presented and discussed in 2017, and give you 5 building blocks for practical steps we could take. You know, the dirty secrets of philosophers is that we invent words, and we get paid for it even every month. So one word I invented was Bewusstseinskultur in 1994, and I have a very interesting experience now. I introduced that concept in a number of popular publications, and now, a quarter century later, it suddenly becomes very attractive to many people and everybody talks about it. A strange experience for me. So, Bewusstseinskultur, consciousness culture, or developing a culture of consciousness, means to complement standard ethics by a small little branch, taking an ethical stance to your own mental states. You don't only ask, as we would normally do, what is a good action, but you also ask, what is a good state of consciousness? Different people might have different answers. When you have come to results of what you think are valuable states, you begin to systematically cultivate them, and then you start a rational evidence process of embedding these conscious experiences into culture. That's one core aspect of Bewusstseinskultur. It's, of course, an old idea. I'm not the first one. For instance, Cicero, in trying to define what philosophy, loving wisdom, really is, had exactly this motive, taking care and cultivating the soul. Pflege der Seele aber ist die Philosophie. So this is an old motive in Western philosophy, and today we have a lot of new and powerful tools. So what does it mean? It means many things. It can mean creating humane technology for the ethical design of medial environments. Think of the work of Tristan Harris in America. It can mean sentience politics, thinking about animal ethics and animal rights. For instance, in animal testing of scientific experiments on psychedelics. It can mean introducing secular meditation practice into the educational system. But it can also mean developing a cultural context for the use of specific substances. And one of the concepts I really like from Henrik is the idea of developing a psychedelic humanism. I could get very complicated now, but I think the idea of generating a Bewusstseinskultur comes down to very simple practical questions. Which states of consciousness should be illegal? I don't know what your reflex is. I think the consciousness states caused by many fentanyl derivatives should be illegal because nobody can control them. There's this reflex to say nothing should be illegal here, but maybe we have to develop a differentiated answer. Which ones do we want to foster and integrate into our society? What states of consciousness can we force upon animals? There's another variant of this question. What states of consciousness do we want to show our children? Or, I don't know if you've ever carefully thought about that, what states of consciousness would you want to die in? Many of such practical questions will make up what I call Bewusstseinskultur, and I think that is the wider context in which all of this takes place. So what we actually have to do is we have to develop the cultural context, which we don't have, in which this specific class of conscious states, which we call the psychedelic experience, can be integrated, firmly grounded in a pro-social attitude. And what we're doing here is one spatial case of doing this, developing a modern Bewusstseinskultur. To do this, I think we need a lot of philosophical virtues, and I'll just list 3 of them. So one thing we should really do is face the facts. Psychedelics, as many people in this room know, can sometimes force you to face facts, even if you don't want to. But what is this thing, the psychedelic experience? I'll give you a definition here. In neurotypical human beings, an extremely large set of possible trajectories through a high-dimensional neural state space opened by pharmacological 5-HT2A activation. So that is, in human beings, the common ground. I know this gets messy on the molecular level. I'm not saying these are necessary and sufficient conditions, but that is the central necessary condition for that state space we're describing. So it's a physical process. You begin to realize what it means to face the facts. Even if it doesn't feel like that, it's a bodily process, even if it doesn't feel like that. And here is a quick argument for you. The psychedelic experience is interesting because the dimensionality, the depth of the relevant state space may be higher than that of ordinary waking consciousness. The topology of that state space is also more complex. That means you can have more conscious experiences under the influence of, say, psilocybin than you can during ordinary wake states. It is relevant because for some targets of knowledge, the epistemic potential of the relevant state space may be higher than that of ordinary waking consciousness. And that is why this neural state space is relevant. So you've seen some of the slides already I'm going to show. Here's another way. Follow me and let's try to get radical and face some facts. Over 35 million users of psychedelics in the US, right? This sounds a lot. It isn't. If we face the fact. Here's the European Drug Report from 2017. And this describes what I call enculturation phase 1. I'm going to explain this later. So you have, Henrik has already told us, less than 1% prevalence for both substances. LSD and mushrooms is stable, generally low for many years, right? So phase 1, in which we are in phase right now, is a phase where illegal use is firmly established. The prevalence is low but stable. A subcultural context exists, clearly, but harm reduction is inefficient, and the profit society has from the intrinsic value of this state of conscious, space of conscious states is very low. We don't get as much out of it as we could. Now let us look at the European Drug Report 2019. Do you notice something? They have cut out exactly the same passage of text from 2 years ago and put it into the report again. It's isomorphic. We've already heard about emergency presentations in hospitals. LSD is really one of the smallest problems we have. We have a dramatic situation, actually. But the thing we are interested in here is such a small portion of the drug problem, facts show in Europe. The psychedelic experience is a marginal problem in the overall scheme of things. The motivation for the use of psychoactive substances in general is hedonistic or nihilistic, not even driven by any values at all. So we have a massive drug problem because we have not evolved a Bewusstseinskultur in time. But psychedelics are almost a negligible part of the picture. So face the facts. Almost all politicians have never taken LSD. Policymakers have no first-person knowledge of the epistemic potential or intrinsic value of those states of consciousness, right? Those people who have are people like Francis Crick, who won the most important Nobel Prize ever, arguably. Far less than 10% of the general population have ever taken LSD. There is no first-person knowledge in the general population. Almost no politicians have an interest in rational, evidence-based enculturation. I'm asking you to face the facts. There are no career incentives in the policy sector for people to do this. The general population does not even understand the need for the things we're talking about here, rational, evidence-based enculturation. They are indifferent and they have other problems with other drugs. So who, let me see, who is from Berlin in this room? And who is from Holland? Okay. Here you see MDMA in wastewater in selected European cities. The burgundy line up there, that's Berlin, right? But that is Utrecht and Amsterdam, the big ones there. Right? So that is the situation we have now. And I have predicted the situation in the only non-academic book I've ever written. It's called The Ego Tunnel, which was published in 2009. I was interested in consciousness technologies, and I made the following prediction. There would be a massive diversification of markets. We would have an explosion of molecular level consciousness technologies, as I call them, and this would happen in the absence of a rational, evidence-based cultural context. Now look, 2019, a decade later, we have 730 historically new psychoactive compounds in Europe, confiscated for the first time. So again, look at this. This is where I made this prediction in 2009. We were peaking in 2014, where there were 101 new molecules confiscated for the first time in Europe. Last year it was 55. We have a situation now by the end of 2018 that there are 730 psychoactive substances on the market in Europe. 20 years ago, we didn't have that problem. None of them have ever been screened for risks, animal tested, or anything. Chinese mafia brings it in, mostly. If you compare, a ridiculous 74,000 hits of LSD have been seized in that period. So that is what the real drug problem is. We have not evolved a Bewusstseinskultur. We have looked the other way for decades, and now we have this massive diversification of mechanisms and molecular level technologies. We have failed to create the cultural context. We have systematically repressed facts, and now we face a massive crisis. We must immediately begin to do our homework, and I think that is why we are here. So here's an argument for you. Psychedelics, in the overall scheme of things, are the optimal place to finally start to do our homework, exactly because the problem is small and tractable in the overall scheme of things. Just think of methamphetamine, cathinines, and all the new fentanyl derivatives. Psychedelics are non-addictive, they have low toxicity. There is, as you've just seen in the last talk, a large body of substantial research is already in existence. The target population is small, and the risks are already well known and documented. So call this the tractability argument. If we want to start, this is the place to start. A second philosophical virtue we need is rationality. We need not psychonauts and not metaphysical ideologies. We need evidence-based rational arguments. So let us look at something that is not a good rational argument.
Markus, warum ist Alkohol erlaubt und Cannabis verboten? 100.000 gegen 0 Tote im Jahr.
Weil Cannabis eine illegale Droge ist. Punkt.
Right? So this is the situation in Germany. Frau Mortler, you must know if you're not from Germany, if you're a failed conservative politician, you get a high-paid job in Brussels as a reward. So she is now a member of the European Parliament, and we really look forward who will have her position next time. But irrationality is much higher, for instance, in the psychonautic community. Let's look at some typical psychonauts fallacy. From the fact that you've encountered and interacted with machine elves, it doesn't follow that machine elves exist. From the fact that you have consciously experienced anything as irrevocably existing, nothing follows about its metaphysical status. So here is my simple example. Every philosophy and cognitive science student in their first year will learn that there are no colored objects in this world, right? There are no blue chairs. The blueness you experience is a property of the model of the chair your brain constitutes. In front of your eyes, there are only wavelength mixtures. And there is no systematic mapping between physical properties and phenomenal properties. You are in a controlled hallucination all the time, in ordinary wake states. I would like to talk about this, but if one takes the best theoretical neuroscience we have today, the free energy principle, predictive coding, and so forth, you are hallucinating right now. You are imposing a model on the upward stream of input. And of course, this doesn't allow any inferences about what exists in the real world. It was what was good in the world of our ancestors, for instance, colored surfaces to increase our fitness, to increase procreative success. Physicists will tell you that not only colors don't exist, objects don't exist as well, individual substances. That's the brain's model of reality. So the best sketchy summary of current theory of consciousness would be that it is a controlled online hallucination, and we learned that metaphysics doesn't follow from phenomenology. There are many interesting philosophical problems here, so we can all look forward to Chris Leatherby's talk. Psychedelics are very interesting from an epistemological perspective, from a theory of knowledge. And that is something that can be developed, a large field. I will all recommend to you this book. Look out for this book, forthcoming with Oxford University Press, if you want to learn something about the philosophy of psychedelics. So, second example, your psychonaut's fallacy, the experience of certainty. I once asked a friend, a philosopher, what is certainty? When I was young, I said, it's knowing that you know, right, analytically. From the fact that you have consciously experienced knowing that you know, nothing follows about the epistemological status of your conscious experience. Example, ecstatic epileptic seizures. As you may know, some epileptics have deep experiences of certainty, blissful oneness with a deep experience of absolute certain knowledge just before the seizure begins. It's a well-known phenomenon. So again, epistemic justification doesn't follow from phenomenology. So you have this, in other situations, the experience of certainty, and it can also be caused by direct electrical stimulation of the anterior insula. I won't go into any details, but the absolute certain feeling that you know something and that you have a deep insight, that can also be caused by an electrode in your brain. You see where this goes, facing the facts? So a frequent fallacy consists in ascribing epistemic status to conscious states because they have what philosophers call the phenomenal signature of knowing. It feels like knowing. We call this the e-fallacy. To make it very simple, just because something feels like an insight, it doesn't mean that it is an insight, right? I'm not going to make any stupid jokes about this conference right now, but you get the point. The experience of knowing can itself be hallucinated. This passage has been taken from an interview I gave to a brilliant journal that is free, the Alius Bulletin, and the newest version of it was just put online on Monday. One of the editors is here, so you can all download this for free, and I highly recommend it. Raphael will be talking on Saturday at 4:15, right? In this room here. So don't miss this. Here's a third thing, the illusion of profundity. From the fact that you have had the experience of a deep sense of ineffable meaningfulness, nothing follows about the meaning of life, life after death, the existence of meaning. Examples are semantic hallucinations. So you know, conscious experience is a controlled online hallucination, and we just have to learn that relevance and meaning can also be something that is hallucinated. So meaning and the experience of meaning are not the same thing. That's the important takeaway message. I was very fascinated with this study by Katrin Preller. I think you all know this study. You can modulate the attribution of meaning and the experience of personal relevance with LSD, for instance, but it's interesting for philosophers because it generates conceptual questions. What exactly is that thing, personal relevance in the brain? What exactly is the process by which the human mind represents meaning? That is where these substances are important for research, because that's a brilliant example how it would be highly relevant for philosophy and for Bewusstseinskultur to understand how this experience of meaningfulness gets generated. But now let's look at the mirror image. Let's look at the superficial critics' fallacies. Just because the conscious experience of deep personal relevance, profundity, ineffable beauty, spiritual insight, therapeutic value has occurred in psychedelic space, it must be a case of hallucination or delusions. I guess you have also encountered this. That's false. Machine elves could exist, right? But we will not find out through smoking DMT. The question is, we need an intersubjective process. Therapeutic or spiritual insights could have a high degree of plausibility. We have to find out in the social culture context, not during the experience. And some aspects of the psychedelic experience could be highly relevant and could be epistemically profound. But the process to find out if they are is Bewusstseinskultur, and I think you all know the classic example of this. From the fact that you are paranoid right now, it doesn't follow that they're not out there to get you, right? That's a deep insight many people on this planet have had. So, epistemic justification may be possible, but it can only happen on an intersubjective level. And Bewusstseinskultur involves exactly this. The psychedelic experience has to be integrated by a process that is intersubjective, pro-social, ethically motivated, rational, and evidence-based. That is how you generate the value. So here's the superficial critic again. Logical mistake number 4. You say the psychedelic experience is a physical process. You say the psychedelic experience is a bodily process, even if it doesn't feel like that. Therefore, it is nothing but a physical process. That famous American philosopher Donald Davidson called that the nothing but reflex in 1981. That's another logical mistake. Multiple levels of description exist. Psychedelic experience always takes place in a social-cultural context. It is also a socio-cultural process, not only something that happens in individual brains. And Bewusstseinskultur is exactly about realizing that social cultural context in which the experience can flourish and show its value. So, third philosophical virtue we need, intellectual honesty. Kant, religion within the boundaries of mere reason. Unfortunately, I cannot talk about philosophy tonight, but here is a simple definition. The sincere intention of being honest towards oneself. It's not that you manage to be honest to yourself, but the sincerity of the intention. And in 1793, one would call this, in a little more old-fashioned language, the idea of the moral good in its absolute purity. That is something you cannot fake. Nobody's looking anyway, right? Either you are honest with yourself and have that intention, or you don't. And the interesting thing about psychedelics is that they make you feel that. Here's a little later incarnation of the same principle, the ethics of belief. There's an ethic to what you believe. William Kingdon Clifford said, "It is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. And at any time, any place, and for every person, it is equally wrong to ignore or carelessly reject the relevant evidence for one's own beliefs." So how can we put this in a modern frame? I think if we want to be honest with ourselves, psychoactive substances are technologies. We have an ethical obligation for intellectual honesty and harm reduction in developing these technologies. And to put it in a very sober and dry way is we have to optimize the global risk-benefit ratio in society for these technologies. That's what an ethical stance is. Due to lacking incentives, as you all know, political institutions and illegal industries have ignored empirical facts and acted unethically. It's a very simple fact that our current way politically dealing with these issues is deeply unethical. So new ethical incentives must be built from the third sector, civil society. We have the first sector, political institutions. There, the incentive landscape doesn't allow for the necessary change in the face of 730 new molecules. Then we have two second sectors. We have a legal industry and an illegal business sector, right? And the third sector is civil society, us here in this room. 2 minutes aside, I just want to give a warning to you. As some of you know, for the last year, I've gone to Brussels because I've been nominated into the high-level expert group on artificial intelligence. We published our ethics guidelines on the 11th of April, and we published policy and investment recommendations for trustworthy AI on the 26th of June. The number one thing I have learned is that ethics washing is going on. In the context of AI, that means that you organize and cultivate ethical debates in order to delay, postpone, avoid, deter, or substitute from policy making and regulation. Google loves it if we talk about ethics, because then there will be no enforceable law, right? But what we need is real rational regulation. So the AI industry has an interest in fake ethics, and we could have that same problem with psychedelics. That's the only point I want to draw your attention to. I want to ask a question to you. Who has an interest in fake Bewusstseinskultur? Who are the entities who don't want this to happen? Can be useful to think about it. You have to defend the Bewusstseinskultur also is something that has to be protected. For example, from people who have something to sell. Some people have to sell a metaphysical ideology on top of these experiences. Some people have to sell some form of mortality denial. Some people have to sell their favorite type of intellectual dishonesty. Take all the New Age, gaga stuff. But you also, for instance, have to protect it from ethically insensitive scientists and clinicians who are only interested in their own academic career and nothing else. Bewusstseinskultur cannot be limited to this, My research, I want to be able to do my research, and I don't care about the social cultural context. Of course, you have to protect it from incompetent politicians, but also, this is a warning about the future, from the purely commercial interest of, for example, American entrepreneurs trying to dominate what they perceive as an important future market. That's a danger to Bewusstseinskultur, and we have all to watch out for it together. But you also have to protect it from the Chinese mafia, already flooding the world with research chemicals today. So this brings me to the final 7 minutes of this talk. I want to make 5 proposals for phase 2 of enculturation. Why do I talk about phase 2? The example of LSD. Phase 1 began on April 16, 1943. Millions of people have taken LSD since then. An illegal market has emerged, supply chains, there's a small industry. There's also a stable subcultural context. And after high use patterns, 1960 to 1975, we have these low, stable use patterns now. Definition of phase 1, you have informal enculturation. There is a new cultural context. It's a subcultural context, but it's only weakly rational and not really evidence-based. And that, from an ethical perspective, is a highly suboptimal situation because we don't optimize the risk-benefit ratio. We miss a lot of the value of these substances. So in 2017, and that's my contribution to our discussion and our panel to take place in 10 minutes here, is I offered 5 building blocks for things we should think about for an enculturation protocol. And now I just want to briefly report to you the interesting criticism I got. So the first thing I proposed 2 years ago was that we develop a mental health pre-screening tool that is specialized on psychedelics, so that we develop a standardized risk assessment for ordinary consumers in non-academic contexts, that there's a formal procedure of regularly updating and developing this tool. The criticism was, this is not as easy as you think, philosopher. It needs a team of experts. It's not so easy to really create a pre-screening tool. You can't have real control groups. You can't create a crisis on purpose and things like that. And there are many things I don't understand, many things about statistics, for instance. But we would really need a tool with high predictive power. And I think the first proposal is the Mind Foundation should form a scientific committee, a task force, that has the goal of developing a standardized pre-screening tool to screen out risk personalities. Building block number 2 is we must reduce the complexity in this first phase. So we should reduce phenomenological state classes, the number of phenomenological state classes we talk about. My proposal was to just in the first 10 years do LSD, psilocybin, MDMA, and 2CB. That proposal was the proposal for which I got the strongest criticism, interestingly, and everybody said the same. Because many people came to me and said, let us focus on one single molecule only for the first 10 years. And let us develop 2 different strategies. One for basic clinical research, and second, a general enculturation agenda. That is something I think we need discussion on. In philosophical terms, that's called the difference between research ethics and consumer ethics. There are some people who say, no enculturation, I don't care about healthy people. Only people with severe problems can have that experience. Only clinical context, only neuroscience. And 2 different ethical agenda for both. So that is what I would like your opinion on. The third building block I offered was, so this is the result. Everybody seemed to say no, psilocybin only. Here's the fourth block. Frequency and timeline. The proposal was, outside of clinical contexts, 2 units per person per year, and a structured timeline for the Enculturation Protocol itself. 10 years for phase 2, a major review in the middle after 5 years, and annual reports and systematic evaluation 2020 to 2030. So the agenda would be to form a committee for this timeline. We need a systematic discussion of what would be a good timeline for the enculturation of psilocybin. Building block number 4 is space. Where can people do this? The possible locations. Where can the regular free citizen in a free society safely undergo psychedelic experience? Everybody, everywhere in her country of citizenship? Only in a medical environment? Special places, meditation centers, newly created beautiful institutions in natural reserves? Or everywhere but only with a professional trip sitter? What do you think? We somehow have to come to a conclusion on this, so we need a discussion on complexity and harm reduction. I think the Mind Foundation needs its own clinic to do clinical research. I think the Mind Foundation needs a full-blown research department which can set up, fund, and coordinate basic research projects. And I think the Mind Foundation needs at least one highly attractive location that offers a protected space to non-patients and non-subjects in scientific experiments, all citizens that have passed that pre-screening test. So we need funding for at least 3 new institutions, I think. And the last building block, before I end, is the idea that we take all risk away from society in the first 10 years. That is, we do risk reduction for society as a whole by developing a compulsory long-term care and occupational disablement insurance. So the idea is that the Enculturation Protocol for phase 2 liberates society from all financial risks. We set up an insurance in the very few people that have prolonged psychotic reactions or disabilities that they are paid for, and that you can just argue to the taxpayer that the whole enculturation phase will never cost them a single cent during the whole time. So this is interesting also for strategic reasons, because if you had that, then you would see that all resistance that comes from society as a whole and conservative politicians is purely ideological and nothing else. Phase 3 would then have 2 options. Either society takes full responsibility for the new cultural context after 10 years, or the experiment goes wrong. Society terminates phase 2. So the agenda for the Mind Foundation, I think, is we should have something like an insurance task force and think about how you could have an insurance for free citizens for the first 10 years in a free society, people who do not have a mental health problem and people who don't want to be subjects in experiments. So we need an insurance policy model. There has been a proposal for somebody to go and systematically evaluate insurance providers, and there has been a proposal to set up an own infrastructure, but nothing much has happened. So let me end with a few conclusions. Creating a new socio-cultural context for the psychedelic experience is part of a larger project. I call it Bewusstseinskultur. Applied ethics. Pharmacological instruments are technologies, their risk-benefit ratio has to be optimized. An evidence-based, realistic, rational, anti-ideological, and intellectually honest approach is the key to the whole enterprise. There's a high degree of urgency. We have a dramatic situation that has arisen after decades of repression. We now have the situation with 730 new untested substances. There was the tractability argument. Psychedelics are the best place to start a discussion on rational enculturation of all these molecules. Due to lacking incentives, political institutions and both business sectors have a strong tendency to act unethically. Therefore, civil society has to lead the debate. And I think we are all ethically obliged to optimize the global risk-benefit ratio and to develop much more systematic and efficient forms of harm reduction. Thank you very much for your attention.